What's going on, everybody? Kalipis Tech here, coming back at you with another video. In this video, I'm going to be giving you my full review of the Cricket Ovation 3 to help you decide whether or not it's the right phone for you. Now, as always, if you do end up wanting to learn more about this phone, definitely check out the description, where I will be linking to several other videos about it, as well as some information about pricing, availability, and some of my favorite smartphone accessories. But with that being said, let's get right into it. So with the Cricket Ovation 3, we're getting a really large 6.82-inch IPS LCD display with a 720p resolution, a PPI of 246, and a 20.5:9 aspect ratio. So for what it is, I do think the display we're getting here is pretty impressive. At 6.82 inches, again, it definitely is a really large display. So if you're going to be on your phone a bit more consuming content, or even doing something like reading, on a larger display like this, of course, things are going to be a bit larger and easier to see in general. So yeah, if you're going to be on your phone a lot, definitely a great thing. And with the 20.5:9 aspect ratio, we are getting a taller and more narrow form factor. So if you're in landscape mode doing something like maybe looking at photos or watching videos, you're going to get a nicer, more immersive experience. Things are going to look a bit better and more cinematic. And then for stuff like browsing the web or maybe scrolling through social media, with a taller and more narrow form factor, you'll be able to fit more content on the screen without having to scroll too much. So yeah, when it comes to size and dimensions, for a more entry-level phone like this, definitely real impressive. Now, when it comes to image quality, on one hand, it's really nothing special. Now, don't get me wrong, it's not bad at all. For only having a 720p resolution, things do look at least decently sharp. The brightness is okay, at least indoors. If you're maybe outside in the sun, for example, I can tell you from experience, the visibility is definitely not quite as good, but really, that's going to go for pretty much any display like this. But again, keep in mind, this is a really inexpensive entry-level device, so you can really only expect so much. So if you're not looking for a super fancy display with a 1080p resolution or AMOLED technology or anything like that, and you really just need something basic that gets the job done, doesn't look bad, and has really good size and dimensions, then in that case, you're really not going to be disappointed here. Now, with the Cricket Ovation 3, this phone does have 32GB of internal storage with microSD card expansion, and honestly, at this point in 2023, this is a bit of a drawback. In this day and age, with things like apps, the system, and just files in general getting larger and larger as time goes on, unless you're really doing barely anything with your phone, 32GB is most likely not going to be enough. I mean, even with microSD card expansion, it's always good to have at least a halfway decent amount of storage on the phone itself. And if you're downloading a bunch of apps, or even just a modest amount for that matter, then keep in mind, with only 32GB, the storage on this phone is going to fill up pretty quickly. Now, to give you an idea of what the storage actually looks like on this phone, right now I have barely anything on it. All I did was download Geekbench 5, and aside from that, it's pretty much just the default apps that came on the phone. And despite me putting barely anything on it, as you can see, I'm already using almost half of the storage on the phone. And for that matter, the system alone takes up 7.1GB. So if you are someone who likes to download a lot of different apps, then I'm sure you can see where this could be a problem. So in general, on one hand, again, if you're really doing the bare minimum on your phone, if you have maybe like 3 apps and nothing else, then yeah, sure, it should be okay. But for any other kind of situation, you're probably going to want to skip this phone and get something that has a bit more storage. Now for security features, with the Cricket Ovation 3, this phone does have Face Unlock, as well as a fingerprint scanner right here on the back. So definitely nice to get both options here. But real quick, let's give the fingerprint scanner a try. There we go, one more time. And there we go. So as you can see there, real fast and responsive, no issues at all. And again, remember, this phone does have Face Unlock too, so if you want to use that instead, you always can. Now taking a look at the camera setup here, with the Cricket Ovation 3, we got a water drop notch for the front facing camera. This camera is 8 megapixels. Then on the back, we got a triple camera setup with a 13 megapixel main camera, a 5 megapixel ultra wide camera, and a 2 megapixel macro camera. So as far as the camera setup goes, for a really entry level device like this, it actually is pretty good. On one hand, sure, there's no depth sensing camera, but I will say portrait mode still does at least work decently well. So honestly, especially for what it is, it's not really that big a deal. But aside from that, this phone again has an ultra wide camera and a macro camera, which in this price range, I wouldn't really call it rare, but I am definitely happy to see it, because there are even a lot of phones that are a lot more expensive than this, like the Samsung Galaxy A14 5G for example, that don't have ultra wide cameras. So if you are in the market for a more lower end device, but you still do want that ultra wide camera, then the Cricket Ovation 3 is going to be a great choice. Now when it comes to photo quality, on one hand, with a device like this, you can really only expect so much. Obviously, if you're getting a phone like this and expecting it to be like Motorola Moto G stylus level, you are going to be disappointed. But honestly, I feel like for what it is, the photo quality we get with this phone is actually pretty good. Sure, it's not going to be like professional studio quality or anything, but if you do like taking the occasional nice photo here and there, you do want things to look good, but you still don't really need the absolute over the top best quality ever, then in that case, for more casual average use, I do think the photo quality we get with the Cricket Ovation 3 is going to be perfectly fine. Now to give you a better idea of what it can do, here's some pictures taken with the Cricket Ovation 3, and yeah, for what it is, I definitely do think they came out pretty nice, and especially with the colors. For a phone like this, I really wasn't expecting things to look this good. So again, for more casual average use, maybe you're just taking pictures for your own memories or to send to friends and family, or even the occasional Instagram photo every now and then. I mean, people aren't going to look at these photos and instantly assume they were taken with a bad camera. So I feel like for that kind of situation, it will be perfectly fine. Now, obviously, if taking photos with your phone is really your thing, then by all means, you're going to want to spend a bit more money or maybe a lot more and get something much higher end. But if you're considering a phone like this, you probably aren't expecting flagship quality or anything close to it. So just keep in mind, for an entry-level device like this, compared to other similar devices I've used, the Cricket Ovation 3 is one of the better choices. Now, when it comes to RAM and processor, with the Cricket Ovation 3, this phone has 3GB of RAM with the MediaTek Helio A25 processor. So in general, for overall performance, it's pretty much what you might expect for a more entry-level phone like this. On one hand, definitely not what I would consider a fast phone, but on the other hand, compared to a bunch of other phones like this, like for example, the Motorola Moto G Play 2023, Samsung Galaxy A13 4G, and some of the more affordable TCL phones. Sure, while the Cricket Ovation 3 definitely, again, doesn't really have crazy good performance, it is still going to be significantly better than those phones. So sure, this is a really entry-level device meant for more basic, light use. But that being said, if you are going to be doing those basic activities, but you're just going to be doing them a bit more often, then in that case, compared to other phones like it, I do think you will get a pretty good experience. Now, I did run a benchmark test on this phone using Geekbench 5. And here are the results I got. So what I recommend doing is running this test on your current phone and then comparing your results to these, and that's going to give you a better idea of where this phone stands performance-wise. In general, I feel like for a lot of people, it might not necessarily be an upgrade per se, but if you're really not looking for something with crazy good performance and you really just want a solid device that works for, again, more basic activities, then again, I do think this phone is going to be perfectly fine for that. Now for the battery, the Cricket Ovation 3 has a 4000 mAh battery that supports 10-watt fast charging, so not bad, but considering there are Motorola and Samsung phones out there, for example, that all have 5000 mAh batteries. If you really care about the battery and that's really a priority for you, then you can easily do better. But at the same time, if you don't really care that much about the battery, maybe you're like me and you have your phone plugged in almost all the time anyway, then just keep in mind the battery life on this phone is not terrible. And even though it only has 10-watt fast charging, air quotes for that because I personally don't consider 10-watt fast charging even fast charging. But despite this, the charging speeds in my opinion are at least decent, especially for someone who doesn't really care that much about the battery and again just has their phone plugged in all day anyway. If you are in that situation, which I feel like a decent amount of people probably are, then yeah, you're not going to have to worry about the battery on this phone. It's not the best, but it's also again not really bad. But on the other hand, if you are looking for a phone that really does have a good battery, then keep in mind, even in this price range, you can still do better. Now as far as the software goes, the Cricket Ovation 3 does have Android 12, which on one hand isn't Android 13, but on the other hand, for a phone like this, I definitely didn't expect it. So considering this phone is pretty much in the lowest tier as an entry-level phone, and it's a carrier branded phone, I feel like having Android 12 is perfectly fine. Now, as far as other features go, surprisingly with the Cricket Ovation 3, we are getting NFC. So if you like to make contactless mobile payments using Tap and Pay, you'll be happy to know you actually can with this phone. Now, excluding carrier deals, like I know Cricket offers a ton of crazy deals on stuff like the A14 5G, for example, but ignoring those, just considering full price, I feel like this is the cheapest phone I've ever seen that actually has NFC. And it definitely gives me hope that in the future, we're going to start to see more and more affordable devices that have this feature. Because at this point in 2023, pretty much every store I've been to in the last year or so has Tap and Pay. So this feature is obviously becoming more and more popular and widely used. And because of this, I feel like every smartphone should have NFC at this point. But unfortunately, that's really not the case. But of course, if you are looking for a really affordable phone that has NFC, then you are going to be happy with the Cricket Ovation 3. On the other hand though, one kind of unfortunate thing the Cricket Ovation 3 doesn't have is stereo audio. Now, I don't know how much this actually matters to people. I personally just really don't like using headphones, so I avoid it whenever I can. So when I'm consuming content, I usually rely on my phone's built-in speaker quite a bit. And because of this, when a phone doesn't have stereo audio, I definitely notice right away. Now, in case you don't know what this means, when a phone does have stereo audio, when you're doing something like watching a video or listening to music, sound is going to come out of both the main speaker and the earpiece. But unfortunately with this phone, since it doesn't have stereo audio, when you're consuming content, sound only comes out of the main speaker. And again, in my opinion, when a phone is like this, it definitely doesn't sound nearly as good. Now, of course, if you use headphones all the time anyway, or maybe you're just not really consuming a bunch of content, then you're probably not even going to notice. But just keep in mind, if you are doing that kind of stuff, and that is something that matters to you, then you might be a little disappointed here. Now, real quick, I do want to give you an idea of what it's actually like to consume content on this phone. I don't know if the audio is actually going to do it justice, but take a look at this next clip. More mid-range phones to have something like an IPS LCD, because in that kind of setting, when you're in a really bright area, so as you can see, when I cover the main speaker, you really can't hear anything. But aside from that, I do feel like the image itself looks pretty decent. All this small per se, especially compared to is something like a typical iPhone or a Google Pixel 6a, for example. So in general, I want to say most phones in this price range, or at least the price range this phone was originally in, is quite a bit cheaper now. Now this is definitely kind of subjective, so I'll let you be the judge of whether or not that was actually good. But in my opinion, for what it is, considering this is a really inexpensive entry-level phone, sure, I didn't really like the audio quality just because it doesn't have stereo audio, and I'm just picky about that. But aside from that, when it comes to the image quality and stuff like that, I do think it is pretty decent, so especially if you're using headphones a lot, if you are consuming a good amount of content, despite this phone again only having a 720p resolution, I feel like for what it is, you still are going to get a pretty good experience. Now taking a look at the overall design, I actually really do like how this phone looks and feels. Sure, it's not anything different, but entry-level phones have pretty much looked the same for 5 years or more. So I'm not really that surprised by it. I feel like at this point, there's really not a whole lot else they can do to a phone's design. And aside from that, most people are probably going to be using a case anyway, so it only really matters so much. But speaking of which, when it comes to a really large phone like this, one problem you might face when you use certain cases is that with a larger phone like this, it can get pretty bulky. But luckily, with the Cricket Ovation 3, despite it having a really large display, I feel like it's just as sleek and modern as pretty much any other phone. So I feel like in that kind of situation, you're really not going to have to worry. And even with a case, for most people, holding and using it is still probably going to be perfectly fine. The other thing I like about this phone is the materials and build quality. As you can probably imagine, the phone is made entirely of plastic, except for the glass display, of course. But yeah, everything else is plastic. But despite this, the plastic does feel decently high quality. The buttons are solid and the build quality in general is pretty good. And the phone also has a decent amount of weight to it too. So in general, despite not feeling premium or anything, it does still feel like a pretty solid device. But in conclusion, my general thoughts about the Cricket Ovation 3. In general, for what it is, I actually do think this is a pretty good phone. Sure, when it comes to stuff like the software, there are bound to be some bugs and lemons here and there, but with the $120 phone that you're probably going to get for free anyway, that's really to be expected, and honestly, no matter which phone you get in this price range, it's not really going to be a whole lot different. That being said though, with the Cricket Ovation 3, a few things I really like about this phone are, first of all, again, the display. With this phone, despite not having a crazy good image quality, having a really large display and a really good form factor definitely make for a great experience when you're consuming content. So if that's really one of the main things you're doing on your phone, maybe you're watching lots of YouTube videos and stuff like that, then in that case, the Cricket Ovation 3 is going to be a real good choice. It also has a really usable camera for what it is. So if you want good photo quality and an ultra wide camera, you're definitely not going to go wrong here. It also has pretty acceptable performance, a decent design, and again, it does have NFC, which is definitely not a feature you find every day in a phone like this. So if you are looking for a really inexpensive, affordable device for more light use and basic activities, then I definitely think the Cricket Ovation 3 is really worth considering. Now, once again, if you do want to learn more about this phone, definitely check out the description, where I will be linking to several other videos about it, as well as some information about pricing, availability, and some of my favorite smartphone accessories. But that's it for this video. If you enjoyed it and found it useful, be sure to give it a thumbs up and hit that subscribe button. Don't forget to follow Kalipis Tech on Twitter and Instagram. And as always, I will see you in the next video.